Most of the rest of the world, also with people in the Middle East and in Africa, see NATO essentially as the apparatus of the American industrial complex and then supported by the military industrial complex in Europe. The West today is 15% of the world's population. For 400 years, it dominated, and as Tariq has said, through subjugation, oppression, genocide, and everything else. In that mindset is a fear. Vietnam was essentially a bomb to smithereens, and they beat the Americans. You would have thought that the Vietnamese would have great resentment. The Vietnamese don't hold a grudge. They're not interested in wars. They're interested in development. I'd like to just start by reminding everybody that the view that in many parts of the world, particularly after NATO, which stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, overstepped and then helped the Americans in their invasion of Afghanistan, frightened everybody. And so many of the people in this part of the region see NATO as an extension of the American military empire, the American industrial complex. But it's also important to understand that most of the rest of the world, also with people in the Middle East and in Africa, see NATO essentially as the apparatus of the American industrial complex and then supported by the military industrial complex in Europe, and that essentially helping to promote the hegemony of the West, led by the United States. What is interesting at the moment, and I think some of us are chuckling a bit, is to see how Europe is reacting to the sort of the belligerence, the thuggery of the American government, particularly with regard to Greenland. The farce, the farcical sort of, what can I say, appearances of many of the European politicians, and of course the American president at Davos this week, has also bemused people in terms of the fracture that is taking place. And Animah, you mentioned the speech by the Canadian Prime Minister, which was seen, at least in the Western eyes, as a real sort of turning point in the Western leaders saying this for the first time. But as you also pointed out, everything he said, we have actually lived through and experienced it to this day. But the point that he made that made me wonder whether he understood the hypocrisy when he talked about if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. Most of us have been on the menu for a long time, while he had been at the table. And I believe the Canada is part of the G7. What is that if not being at the main table? A small country with 42 million people, a white settler community at the main table for decades, and having us all on the menu and finally waking up. But where was Carney last year when the carnage and genocide in Gaza was taking place? It seemed to me that the genocide didn't provoke him enough to talk about the fracture or whatever the word, the rupture that he mentioned in the Western world order. That was not enough. It was apparently just some threats from a bully across the border saying your tariffs are going to go up. And that was enough to freak him out into talking about a new world order and a rupture. Not the genocide, not the fact that he had been at the main table. His country was part of NATO, invaded so many other countries. So from this part of the world, I think NATO looks like the military establishment of the United States, a large economic entity, and many of you will know that there's a lot been written about the fact that essentially it's an economic enterprise embedded within the American economy. The tech companies are all part of the NATO system. And NATO stretches beyond just the Europeans and the Americans. It has its little brothers in Australia and, of course, in New Zealand too. A more benign, but still part of the superstructure. So as we talk about NATO in Asia, we always think about the nature by which America flexes its muscles here. In muscle, the amount of bases America has in Asia is the largest amount in the world. And it's supported by the sort of the backing of the NATO political leaders as well. But in the rest of the world, I think NATO is viewed as essentially part of the American expansionists, the supremacy of the European alliance, and therefore something that we need to remove. I will say that until about a few years ago, especially the elite Asians, who were all brought up in the tradition of the sort of Western liberal ideas about democracy. And that facade has been removed in the last couple of years. And many of you may not be aware, but the extension of the American influence into this part of the region included an attempt, as we all know, to undermine China for a long time. And NATO was trying to use an excuse that the Western sort of narrative, the idea that China would attack Taiwan was a perfect excuse for NATO then to say we need to essentially be involved. And I'll finish by saying that we got a wake-up call about 2 or 3 years ago when the NATO Secretary Generals, and most of them seem to be rabid European politicians, had said something to the effect that the next step for NATO to counter the China threat, China is not about to invade USA nor Europe, by the way, is to establish a presence in Asia. And they were trying to persuade the Japanese that NATO needed to have a presence in Japan. And the narrative was to protect Taiwan because China was going to attack Taiwan. That fortunately did not transpire. The Japanese did not agree. Most of Asia reacted quite negatively to it. And I'll finish by saying that when I mention Australia and New Zealand as proxies, and this is very important for those of you who may not be aware, but I think many people are aware of may be aware of the Five Eyes alliance, which is the oldest intelligence alliance. And interestingly, it's an Anglo-Saxon alliance. It's made up of the UK, the US, Canada, so Connie, take note, Australia and New Zealand. Guess what the rest of the world thinks about this? So even within Europe, I know European politicians are rather irritated by the fact that they may have NATO and all the alliances, but within that alliance, there is the Five Eyes, and that is the Anglo-Saxon White Settler Community Alliance, and that sits in our part of the world too. And therein lies great resentment about how do these guys have disproportional discussions and debates. And it's the population of Australia and New Zealand combined would just about exceed 30 million people. But what was important was with the Americans then, given that they're the prime drivers of NATO, then went and formed an alliance to destabilize China and form a new military alliance, even if NATO per se was not going to be in Asia, called the Quad. And for those who are interested, the Quad is basically made up, interestingly, in Asia by the United States. And I love Japan, but my poor brothers in Japan are still traumatized by the nuclear attack on them, that they are poodles to the Americans when it comes to geopolitics. And then, unfortunately, India, who I think besmirched its reputation in many quarters by even joining this sort of Mickey Mouse outfit called the Quad. But the Quad was, in a way, the Americans with their Australian allies, part of the proxy NATO in our part of the world, attempting to create a counter if NATO itself couldn't be said to have a presence here. And finally, I would say, as many nations in this part of the world have been attacked in sort of diplomatic circles by Europeans because they have not been outspokenly critical of Russia. And there's a reason for that. We know how this stuff works. And we know that, and I'll say this now, that as much as no one can condone the invasion, we have seen other invasions. And as no one can condone what's happening, we also know what provocations were led to it. And we know that if China or large Asian country had plans to install military bases in Mexico, the Americans and Europeans would immediately be outraged and bomb it. So that's why there's not support for Russia, but essentially a view that this is not as simple as they would like us to believe, because we know where this comes from. We've all been there before, and it's not black and white. Many in the West tend to want to see the world through the lens of their anxieties and fears. One of the anxieties that is persistent in the West is the anxiety knowing that we're the minority. The West today is 15% of the world's population. For 400 years, it dominated, and as Tariq has said, through subjugation, oppression, genocide, and everything else. In that mindset is a fear that firstly, a sense of superiority. If you've been charged for so long, no matter if you're a liberal living in London, etc., you still have this sense, I'm superior to those people. But because I'm a liberal, my narratives are slightly different. By God, don't suggest that they are equal to me, but I will not utter it, not in the places, in the clubs I belong to, because it's not polite conversation. The fear is that the others, if they become as powerful, will do to us what we did to them. But what they don't understand is the others have no interest in this. And this is why, to Tariq's point, there is no interest in spending so much money. And there's actually, when you spend that kind of money, you're buying usually typically from big arms manufacturers, etc. You're providing economic growth to the Europeans, the Americans in particular. That's what they want to do, deals. Of course, other countries, particularly China, is also makes and exports arms. But the biggest beneficiaries of a militarized world is the United States and the USA. So the others have no interest in this, really no interest. And a good example, and I come from Southeast Asia, is Vietnam. Vietnam was essentially a bomb to smithereens, Cambodia, and they beat the Americans. They beat the French before, they beat the Americans. You would have thought that the Vietnamese would have great resentment. The Vietnamese don't hold a grudge. Why? After 100 years or 200 years, particularly about 100 years of suffering, they're not interested in wars. They're interested in development. They're interested in, of course, defense protection, but that comes through a different approach, which is negotiations, alliances in the region. The ASEAN region has had no conflict of any sort of major consequences since the Americans left. None. And the Chinese, and this is very difficult, I think, for Europeans to understand, now that has really changed. And one of the things that I think Donald Trump has done is actually taken the mask off and said, we're white supremacists. We want to go back to the old ways. We want to rule over you. And because we have, as Tariq said, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, and we have the military, we can print, we can produce, we will seek to bully you to the utmost. And he's the extreme version, but the same can be said of Barack Obama and all the rest. It was this American exceptionalism based on military might and the rest. And although Barack Obama was a black man, he worked for the white supremacist organization of the United States. He was just a prisoner of that same old system, which is dominant and requires an enemy. So the hypocrisy which Tariq mentioned, and we are just like, okay, we don't need to listen to these people anymore. We have our own problems. And let me just say that I'm not saying that there are no problems, there are massive problems here. There are corrupt governments and all of that. But we don't need lessons from the West, and certainly we don't need military intervention from the West. We need to sort our own problems out because we've had enough problems created by intervention, military intervention of essentially an economic vehicle called NATO.